A kingdom stands on the edge of collapse, its throne shaking beneath the weight of rebellion, old loyalties, and buried promises. In this fragile moment of shifting power, a single act of deception will change the destiny of two men forever. Before we unravel how a servant named Ziba altered the story of a forgotten prince, tell me in the comments which country you are watching from, and subscribe if you enjoy deep explorations of sacred history. Now, let us step into a moment of scripture where loyalty, fear, and ambition collide in a way few people ever notice. Israel had only recently emerged from the long and troubled era of King Saul, and although David now sat on the throne, the nation was still carrying wounds from years of conflict. The people had seen wars between tribes, shifts in power, and tensions between families who once stood proudly under Saul's banner. David's rise to power was not a smooth transition. It came with suspicion, rivalry, and the memory of a dynasty that had fallen from glory. Into this uncertain world lived two figures whose stories intertwined at the heart of Israel's fragile unity. Ziba, a former servant of Saul's household, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan and the grandson of the fallen king. Their lives were shaped by the shadows of the past and the expectations of a nation still finding its footing under David's rule. Although their paths were different, their futures would crash into each other at the moment Israel needed truth the most. Ziba enters the pages of scripture not as a simple household servant, but as a man unusually influential for his position. When David summons him, the text reveals that Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants under his authority, a detail that speaks volumes about his status. A man with this level of command was far more than a hired hand. He was the manager of Saul's estate, a figure trusted with land, labor, and resources that once belonged to the royal family. Holding this kind of responsibility placed Ziba in a unique position, one where privilege and opportunity often walked side by side with ambition. When he stood before David, he did not come trembling or uncertain. He came as someone who understood the weight of politics, the value of land, and the advantage of knowing what a king desired to hear. Ziba's answers were smooth, respectful, and calculated, giving the impression of a man who always knew how to land on the winning side of a shifting kingdom. He was a servant by title, but in influence, he was closer to a landowner, a strategist, and perhaps even an opportunist waiting for the right moment to act. While Ziba moved with confidence, Mephibosheth lived in obscurity, carrying a story marked by tragedy and vulnerability. As a child, he had been crippled in both feet when his nurse fled in panic after hearing of Saul and Jonathan's deaths in battle. His life changed from royal promise to lonely survival almost instantly, and for years he lived far from Jerusalem, hidden and forgotten. To live as the descendant of a fallen king was not safe, especially when new rulers often saw old heirs as threats. Mephibosheth was not only physically disabled but politically dangerous in the eyes of many, and so he remained in the background, surviving quietly without expectations. Yet the covenant between David and Jonathan had not been forgotten by the king. Driven by loyalty and love for his late friend, David searched for any surviving member of Jonathan's family to show kindness for his sake. When Mephibosheth was finally brought before David, he arrived overwhelmed and fearful, expecting judgment rather than mercy. But in a stunning act of grace, David restored to him all the land that belonged to Saul and welcomed him permanently, to dine at the king's table as one of the king's own sons. And it is here that Ziba's role shifted dramatically, for David commanded him to work the land for Mephibosheth and manage it on his behalf. From that moment forward, Ziba's wealth, routine, and influence were tied directly to the man he served, creating a relationship that appeared loyal on the surface but held quiet tension beneath. For Ziba, this meant stepping back from controlling the estate to serving the rightful heir of Saul's household, and scripture allows us to sense that this shift may have stirred something deep and silent inside him, something that would reveal itself in a moment of national crisis. Ziba's new position might have looked honorable on the surface, but beneath that polished arrangement lived a tension that scripture allows us to sense if we pay close attention. When David restored Saul's entire estate to Mephibosheth, Ziba suddenly shifted from being the one who managed everything to being the one who served someone else's authority. For a man who had commanded servants, organized land, overseen harvests, and acted almost like a steward lord over Saul's former property, giving up that level of control would not have been a small adjustment. His wealth, his influence, his reputation, and even his identity had been wrapped around that estate, and now the rightful heir had returned. Although scripture does not record resentment explicitly, the narrative strongly hints that Ziba was a man who understood opportunity, timing, and the weaknesses of powerful leaders. His loyalty to Mephibosheth was a loyalty demanded by the king, not one produced from a faithful heart. And when a relationship begins with obligation rather than devotion, it often cracks when pressure rises. David commanded Ziba to work the land for Mephibosheth, to bring in the produce, and to ensure the estate thrived under Mephibosheth's name. But Ziba still had his own household, his own sons, and his own servants who depended on him, and that meant he had much to lose if the winds of power changed again. In a kingdom still healing from Saul's fall and still adjusting to David's reign, uncertainty always lingered, and ambition often waited quietly in the shadows for the right moment to step forward. That moment arrived when David faced one of the most heartbreaking events of his life, the rebellion of his son Absalom. Absalom's actions were not a small dispute or a political disagreement. He had stolen the loyalty of the people, taken advantage of David's compassion, and launched a full-scale revolt that forced the king to flee Jerusalem in grief. David left behind his palace, his position, and the security of the throne as he crossed the Mount of Olives barefoot and weeping, surrounded by loyal supporters who were just as shaken by the chaos. It was in this desperate, vulnerable moment that Ziba stepped into the story again, approaching David with donkeys loaded with bread, raisins, fruit, and wine. To a fleeing king who had not even had time to prepare provisions, Ziba's arrival must have seemed like a lifeline. The timing was perfect, almost too perfect, because Ziba appeared not just with supplies, but with a story ready to shape David's mind. When David asked why Mephibosheth was not with him, Ziba answered with a bold accusation. He claimed that Mephibosheth had stayed in Jerusalem, hoping the kingdom of Saul would be restored to him. In other words, Ziba accused Mephibosheth of betraying David in the moment the king needed loyalty the most. It was a devastating claim, one crafted with precision, because it played on the deepest insecurities of David's reign, the fear that remnants of Saul's house still wished to reclaim the throne. Mephibosheth was the only surviving grandson of Saul, and Ziba's lie fit perfectly into the old tensions between the previous dynasty and the current one. David, overwhelmed by pain, humiliation, and uncertainty, accepted the lie without questioning it, and in his exhaustion, he made a decision that would echo far beyond that moment. He immediately granted Ziba everything that belonged to Mephibosheth. Ziba's deception worked because it exploited a whirlwind of emotion. David was running for his life, betrayed by his own son, unsure whom he could trust. In a moment like that, when a familiar servant arrives with supplies and a story that seems believable, the mind is vulnerable. David did not investigate, did not send for witnesses, did not wait for clarity. Instead, he reacted as a man drowning in betrayal, quick to latch onto the idea that someone else had abandoned him. Ziba seized that moment with absolute precision, proving that ambition often disguises itself as helpfulness. By offering gifts, he masked his motive. By bringing news, he controlled the narrative. By speaking first, he shaped David's perception before Mephibosheth ever had a chance to be heard. This single conversation, this carefully crafted accusation secured for Ziba what he had likely wanted ever since Mephibosheth was restored: control of Saul's estate. Yet despite the success of Ziba's deception in that moment, the story does not end with his triumph. Scripture holds the tension until David returns victorious and Mephibosheth finally appears before him. But at the point where Ziba walks away with everything, the narrative invites us to consider how easily truth can be overshadowed when crisis clouds judgment. David's quick decision reveals the human vulnerability of even the greatest king, and Ziba's lie exposes how dangerous unanswered accusations can be. His betrayal stands as a quiet warning that the most damaging lies are often the ones told at the perfect moment, when the wounded heart is too tired to discern truth from manipulation. And as the king fled into the wilderness, carrying the weight of both Absalom's betrayal and Mephibosheth's supposed disloyalty, the consequences of Ziba's ambition settled into the unfolding story like a shadow waiting to be confronted. When David finally returned to Jerusalem after Absalom's rebellion collapsed, the city carried the weight of everything that had happened: the betrayal of a son, the scattering of loyal followers, and the painful memories of a king forced to flee his own home. Yet among the many people waiting to greet David, one figure stood out immediately: Mephibosheth. The man who had been accused of abandoning David, the man Ziba claimed was plotting to reclaim Saul's throne, now approached the king in a condition that told a story without a single word spoken. His clothes were unwashed, his hair uncared for, and his feet crippled since childhood were neglected to the point that it was immediately clear he had not tended to himself since the day David fled. This sight alone would have been shocking, because a man seeking to reclaim power does not neglect his appearance during the most critical moments of national upheaval. Mephibosheth's appearance was not one of a schemer but of a man grieving deeply, displaying loyalty in the only way he could while separated from the king. When David saw him, the contrast between Ziba's story and Mephibosheth's condition struck with undeniable force. David immediately confronted him, asking why he had not joined him during the escape. Mephibosheth then revealed the truth with words filled with pain, humility, and a kind of wounded innocence that no liar could have fabricated. He explained that as a disabled man, he relied entirely on Ziba to transport him, but Ziba had abandoned him and taken the prepared supplies for himself. Ziba then used that opportunity to present himself to David, twisting the situation to make Mephibosheth appear disloyal. Mephibosheth did not try to defend himself by attacking Ziba's character or arguing for his own rights. Instead, he acknowledged that David could judge him however he pleased, because he owed his life and restoration entirely to the king. He declared that his loyalty remained with David regardless of accusations or misunderstandings. His grief during David's absence was visible proof of his devotion. What mattered to him was not land or inheritance, but the safety and return of the king who had shown him undeserved kindness. This raw, heartfelt explanation shattered the false narrative Ziba had crafted, revealing the heartbreaking truth that Mephibosheth had been a victim of betrayal rather than its perpetrator. David's response to this revelation is one of the most debated decisions in the entire narrative, because it carries the weight of human exhaustion, political sensitivity, and emotional complexity. Instead of fully restoring the estate to Mephibosheth, David declared that the land should be divided between him and Ziba. This judgment has puzzled scholars, readers, and believers for centuries. Some believe David was simply worn down by the trauma of the rebellion and was too emotionally drained to revisit the issue thoroughly. Others think David was trying to avoid further tension by maintaining some balance between the households. And still others see in this decision a reflection of David's own fractured state of mind, where clarity was hard to reach after facing betrayal from his own flesh and blood. But Mephibosheth's response to David's verdict revealed the depth of his character in a moment that demanded honesty. Instead of defending his rights, pleading for justice, or expressing outrage at the unfairness of losing half of what he deserved, Mephibosheth responded with a statement that cut straight to the heart. He said Ziba could take everything as long as David had returned in peace. Those words revealed a loyalty that was rooted not in material inheritance or political power, but in genuine devotion to the king who had restored his dignity. Mephibosheth's heart was focused on relationship, not possessions. At that moment, the difference between him and Ziba became clearer than ever. Ziba, throughout the story, acted based on opportunity, fear, and ambition. He used moments of crisis to advance his position, acted strategically when others were vulnerable, and took advantage of the confusion surrounding the rebellion to gain control of land and authority. His actions were calculated, timed carefully, and executed with an understanding of how human emotion can influence judgment. Mephibosheth, on the other hand, acted from a place of gratitude, humility, and unwavering loyalty rooted in the kindness David had shown him years earlier. When given the chance to defend himself, he did not manipulate or exaggerate. He simply told the truth, trusting that David, despite recent turmoil, could see past the web of deception laid before him. His lack of concern for material gain and his sorrow over David's suffering showed a purity of loyalty that Ziba never possessed. These contrasting responses reveal a powerful theme in Scripture. The heart's posture matters more than outward status, and true loyalty is not proven in words but in actions when circumstances grow difficult. The story of Ziba and Mephibosheth ultimately teaches several profound lessons that reach far beyond their moment in history. It reminds us that not every act of apparent generosity comes from a place of sincerity, because sometimes gifts are used as weapons and help is offered with hidden motives. It warns that deception often thrives during chaos, when those in authority are wounded, pressured, or desperate for support. It illustrates how easily a carefully timed lie can overshadow truth when a leader is burdened by fear and betrayal. It shows the danger of making quick decisions in emotional distress, a mistake even great leaders can fall into. And perhaps most importantly, it highlights the importance of character, revealing that loyalty rooted in gratitude and humility stands far stronger than loyalty rooted in convenience or ambition. Ziba's legacy becomes a cautionary tale of how ambition can disguise itself with the appearance of service, while Mephibosheth's legacy stands as a model of faithfulness even in the face of injustice and misunderstanding. When the story closes, Scripture does not tell us Ziba's final fate, nor does it describe how he responded to David's partial judgment. Instead, the narrative leaves us with the unforgettable contrast between two men shaped by the same household but driven by entirely different motives. Ziba is remembered as the servant who seized opportunity through deception, while Mephibosheth is remembered as the broken man who chose loyalty over material gain. Through their lives, we see a reflection of a deeper truth woven throughout Scripture, that God looks beyond appearances and judges the heart. In the tension between deception and devotion, between ambition and humility, the story calls us to examine our own motives and to seek the kind of faithfulness Mephibosheth displayed, a faithfulness that values relationship over reward and truth over advantage. And as David's story continues, the lessons from Ziba's betrayal stand as a reminder of how fragile trust can be, how easily lies can distort justice, and how vital it is to seek wisdom in moments of emotional turmoil.